They started laughing before she even said a word, and the sound followed her like something heavy pressing on her chest, because she knew in that moment that no matter what she did next, they had already decided who she was. She stood quietly at the glass counter, still wearing her light blue nurse uniform, hands folded gently in front of her, eyes calm but tired, and one of the men leaned closer and said, "Put that down, this isn't a toy store," and the other man laughed so loudly that even the clerk behind the counter looked uncomfortable. She didn't answer right away, because she had learned a long time ago that sometimes silence protects you more than words ever could, especially when people see your clothes before they see your heart. She only nodded slowly and placed the small box back on the counter as if it were something fragile, and for a second her fingers stayed there, like she was afraid to let go of the only thing that made her feel safe outside the hospital. The store smelled like metal and oil, the walls were lined with rifles and locked cases, and she felt smaller than she had in years, not because she was weak, but because humiliation always finds a quiet place inside you and makes itself comfortable. One of the men tapped the glass with his finger and said loudly, "Let me guess, you saw it in a movie and now you want to play hero," and the other man smirked and added, "Maybe you should go back to bandages and medicine, sweetheart," and the word sweetheart hurt more than the laughter, because it wasn't kind, it was meant to remind her that she didn't belong there. She swallowed the words she wanted to say, because she wasn't there for them, she was there for someone who depended on her, someone who didn't even know how hard this small step had been for her. Her name was Emily, and 3 months earlier she had been standing in a hospital corridor holding a paper cup of cold coffee, listening to a doctor explain that her father's condition would not improve the way they had hoped. She remembered the quiet in that hallway, the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring, and the doctor's voice sounded calm but distant as he spoke about risks and safety and what might happen if her father had another episode when she wasn't home. Emily had nodded then too, just like she was nodding now in the store, because when life hits you hard enough, you stop arguing with it and start surviving it instead. One of the men at the counter crossed his arms and said, "People like you shouldn't even be allowed in here," and the words felt like a door closing somewhere inside her, but she kept her back straight and her voice soft when she finally spoke. She said she just wanted to ask a question, nothing more, and the clerk looked at the men as if asking for permission before answering her, which made the humiliation feel even heavier. The man closest to her leaned in again and whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Ask your question somewhere else," and the other one laughed again, like this was entertainment for him, like her embarrassment was something he had paid to see. Emily felt her eyes sting, but she didn't let the tears fall, because she had promised herself that she would not cry in front of strangers again, not after everything she had already been through. She remembered her father sitting in his old armchair at home, hands trembling slightly, trying to pretend he was still strong enough to protect her the way he had when she was a child, and that memory gave her just enough strength to stay where she was instead of walking out. She tried again, more quietly this time, and said she needed something small, something simple, just something that would make her feel safer at night when she came home from her late shifts. The men exchanged a look and one of them shook his head slowly, like she had just confirmed everything he believed about the world. He said safety wasn't something you bought in a box, and then he added that people like her should learn to accept fear instead of pretending they were strong. The words hit deeper than he knew, because Emily had been accepting fear for most of her life, and the only reason she was standing there now was because she was finally tired of feeling helpless. She lowered her eyes for a moment, not because she was ashamed, but because she was gathering the strength to stay calm, and when she looked up again her voice didn't shake at all. She said she wasn't pretending to be strong, she was trying to become strong, and the store fell quiet for a second, but the silence didn't last long. One of the men rolled his eyes and said, "That's cute," and then he turned to the clerk and said loudly, "You really going to sell anything to someone like that?" And the clerk hesitated again, caught between politeness and fear, and that hesitation hurt Emily more than the insults. She felt invisible and exposed at the same time, like she had stepped into the wrong world and there was no way back out with her dignity still intact. She remembered the night she had walked home after her shift and someone had followed her for half a block before turning away, and the fear from that night had stayed with her ever since, sitting quietly inside her chest every time she stepped into the dark street. That was why she had come here today, not to prove anything, not to impress anyone, but simply to feel safe enough to sleep without waking up every hour. The men didn't know any of that, and they didn't care, because to them she was just a nurse in the wrong place, someone who didn't belong in a world they believed was theirs alone. She was about to turn away when the door behind her opened with a soft sound, and she didn't even look back at first, because she had already decided that leaving quietly would hurt less than staying. The footsteps were calm and steady, and the men at the counter stopped laughing almost at the same time, like something invisible had just entered the room and changed the air. Emily slowly turned her head and saw a tall man in a simple jacket walking toward the counter, his face serious but not angry, and there was something about the way he moved that made everyone else step aside without being told. He looked at the two men first, not at her, and his eyes didn't need to say anything because the silence around him already did. One of the men cleared his throat and tried to smile, but the smile didn't last long when the tall man spoke in a calm voice and asked what exactly was so funny. No one answered right away, because suddenly the laughter felt childish and cruel instead of clever. The tall man then turned his eyes to Emily, and for the first time since she walked into the store, she didn't feel judged or dismissed, she felt seen. He asked her quietly if she was all right, and the kindness in his voice almost broke the wall she had been holding inside her chest all afternoon. She nodded again, because nodding was easier than speaking, and he looked back at the men and said that if they had nothing useful to say, they were welcome to leave. One of them tried to protest, saying they were regular customers, but the tall man simply replied that respect was also a requirement in his store, and the word has changed everything. The clerk straightened immediately, the men went silent, and Emily realized that the man standing beside her wasn't just a customer, he was the owner. The men muttered something under their breath and stepped back, their confidence disappearing so quickly that it almost felt unreal, and for the first time since the humiliation had started, Emily felt a small, quiet hope rise inside her. The owner turned back to her and asked what she needed, and this time the question didn't feel like a test or a trap, it felt like an offer of dignity. She explained softly that she worked night shifts at the hospital, that her father was sick, that she just needed something small to help her feel safe when she came home late, and while she spoke she kept her eyes on the counter because she was afraid that if she looked up and saw pity, the tears would finally fall. But there was no pity in his voice when he answered, only understanding. He said everyone deserved to feel safe, especially someone who spent her nights helping other people survive, and the words settled gently inside her like a promise. He showed her a small, simple option and explained everything slowly, making sure she understood every detail without making her feel foolish, and for the first time that day, Emily felt something stronger than sadness, she felt patience turning into quiet strength. The two men who had laughed at her stood silently near the door, watching the scene unfold in a way they clearly hadn't expected, and the owner didn't look at them again, because the moment wasn't about them anymore. When Emily finally lifted her eyes, she realized her hands weren't shaking the way they had before, and she thanked him in a voice that sounded calmer than she felt. He only smiled slightly and said that courage didn't always look loud, sometimes it looked exactly like what she had just done, walking into a place that terrified her and refusing to leave even when people tried to push her out. The words stayed with her as she finished what she had come to do, and when she turned toward the door, the men moved aside without saying a single word, their arrogance gone, replaced by something close to shame. She stepped outside into the cool air and realized that the weight on her chest had finally lifted, not completely, but enough to let her breathe again. That evening when she reached home, her father was still awake in his chair, waiting the way he always did when she worked late, and when she smiled at him, he smiled back with a kind of quiet pride that made everything she had endured feel worth it. She didn't tell him about the humiliation or the laughter, because she didn't want him to feel guilty for needing her, and instead she just sat beside him and held his hand until the fear inside her softened into something calmer. Days passed, and she returned to her routine at the hospital, moving from room to room with the same quiet strength she had always carried, but something inside her had changed. She no longer felt invisible, because someone had seen her when it mattered most, and that small moment of respect had grown into a steady confidence she could feel even during the hardest nights. One afternoon, as she walked through the hospital corridor, she heard a familiar voice calling her name, and when she turned around, she saw the owner of the store standing there beside an older man with tired but kind eyes. The owner introduced him as his father, the man Emily had helped weeks earlier during a sudden emergency when he had been brought into the hospital alone and frightened. Emily remembered that night immediately, the confusion, the urgency, the way she had stayed with him long after her shift had technically ended because no one else had noticed how scared he was. The older man took her hand gently and thanked her for treating him like family when he felt completely alone, and the owner smiled quietly and said that the respect she had shown his father was the reason he refused to let anyone disrespect her in his store. Emily felt tears finally reach her eyes, but this time they weren't from humiliation, they were from relief, from the realization that kindness sometimes travels in quiet circles and returns when you least expect it. The older man said that the world needed more people like her, people who stayed strong without becoming cruel, and the words felt like justice, not loud or dramatic, but honest and lasting. When they left, Emily stood in the corridor for a long moment, breathing slowly, feeling the sadness and helplessness she had carried for so long finally soften into something brighter. She realized then that strength wasn't about proving yourself to arrogant strangers, it was about staying kind even when the world tried to break you, and as she returned to her work, she knew that the humiliation in the store had not defeated her, it had simply revealed who she truly was, someone quiet, someone patient, someone stronger than anyone who had laughed at her could ever understand.